Relationship therapy. 5 warning signs. Your relationship needs therapy, and what silence really means. When the silence between you starts to feel louder than the words, that's when therapy should begin. It's not dramatic screaming that ends relationships. It's the quiet moments where both of you are present, but nobody's really there. That heaviness in the air, the unspoken resentment, the careful dance around topics that used to be easy. These are the whispers of a relationship asking for help. And today, we're going to explore what those whispers are really saying. If you've ever felt that suffocating silence in your own relationship, do me a favor, pause right now and hit that subscribe button. This conversation might be the most important one you have this week, because understanding these warning signs isn't just about saving a relationship, it's about saving yourself from years of emotional erosion. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll see silence in a completely different light. Today, we're uncovering the 5 warning signs that your relationship needs therapy and what silence really means. Not the comfortable silence of two people who understand each other, but the heavy, suffocating kind that builds walls instead of bridges. The kind that makes you feel like you're walking on eggshells in your own home. We'll explore the real stories from couples therapy sessions, the moments when truth breaks through, and the patterns that relationship therapists recognize immediately. This isn't about judgment or blame. This is about recognition and hope. Because here's what I've learned after years of working with couples. The relationships that seek help aren't the weakest ones. They're often the bravest. The ones willing to sit in the discomfort, to name the pain, to break the silence. And that journey often begins with simply recognizing that something has fundamentally shifted between you and the person you love. So let's set the tone right now. Calm, honest, introspective. This is a safe space to confront uncomfortable truths. Whether you're in a marriage that's lost its spark, a long-term relationship that feels more like roommates, or you're watching someone you care about struggle in silence, this message is for you. Because sometimes the most loving thing we can do is acknowledge when we need help. And that acknowledgement starts with understanding what we're really dealing with. Let me tell you about Sarah and Michael. They sat in my therapy office on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of couple that looks perfect from the outside. Married 12 years, 2 kids, stable careers, a beautiful home. But she cried during the entire first session, and he just sat there, silent, not uncomfortable, not fidgeting, not even pretending to comfort her, just absent. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was deafening. I've seen this pattern countless times in relationship therapy stories. The emotional distance becomes so normalized that couples don't even recognize it anymore. They think they're just getting through it, or that this is what long-term relationships look like. But what they're actually experiencing is a slow emotional death, a gradual disconnection that happens so incrementally they don't notice until they're complete strangers sharing a bed. Sarah's tears weren't just about one issue. They were about years of unspoken pain. After about 20 minutes, I looked directly at Michael and asked one question that changed everything. When did you decide that her pain wasn't worth responding to anymore? The room shifted. His face changed. Sarah stopped crying and looked at him. Really looked at him. For the first time in months, that single question pierced through years of defensive silence and forced them both to confront what they'd been avoiding. That moment illustrates something crucial about couples therapy sessions. Sometimes we need an outside perspective to name what's happening. When you're inside the dysfunction, it becomes your normal. The slow erosion of emotional intimacy feels like maturity or acceptance, when really, it's resignation. Michael hadn't consciously decided to stop caring. He just gradually shut down because engaging felt too exhausting, too vulnerable, too likely to end in conflict. So silence became his refuge. But here's what most people don't understand about therapeutic silence versus relational silence. In therapy, silence can be productive, a space for reflection, for sitting with discomfort, for allowing truth to surface. In relationships, prolonged silence is almost always a symptom of something breaking. It's not peace, it's the sound of two people who've stopped believing that speaking will change anything. And that's where the real danger begins, in that quiet space where hope goes to die. Sarah and Michael's story isn't unique, and that's what makes it so powerful. In my practice, I see variations of this dynamic, Constantly, the emotionally exhausted partner and the one who's checked out. Sometimes the roles reverse midway through the relationship. Sometimes both partners are simultaneously desperate and distant. But the common thread is always this: they've lost the ability to reach each other, and silence has filled the space where connection used to live. What's particularly heartbreaking is how these patterns develop. Relationship advice, real story after story, shows us that couples don't start here. Michael used to leave love notes in Sarah's lunch. Sarah used to text him throughout the day just to share random thoughts. They had inside jokes, spontaneous date nights, conversations that lasted until 2 a.m. The transformation from that intimacy to this silence didn't happen overnight. It happened through 1,000 small moments of choosing disconnection over discomfort. Here's what happened in their case. About 4 years into their marriage, they had their first major conflict about finances. Instead of working through it, they swept it under the rug to keep the peace. Then came disagreements about parenting styles, about time with in-laws, about career decisions. Each time, they chose silence over potentially difficult conversations. Each time, they told themselves they were being mature, avoiding drama, protecting the relationship. But what they were actually doing was teaching each other that honest communication wasn't safe. This is the emotional disconnect that therapists recognize immediately. When I asked Michael that pointed question, he initially couldn't answer, not because he was being stubborn, but because he genuinely hadn't realized he'd made that choice. The shutdown happened so gradually that he experienced it as just how things are now. Sarah's constant emotional expressions started feeling like attacks to him, so he protected himself the only way he knew how, by building walls of silence. That session became a turning point, but not in the Hollywood way you might imagine. There was no immediate breakthrough, no tearful reconciliation in that first hour. Instead, they both began to see their pattern clearly for the first time. And that clarity, as painful as it was, created the first real opening for change they'd had in years. Because you cannot heal what you cannot see, and they'd both been blind to how profoundly disconnected they'd become. The first warning sign that your relationship needs therapy is when conversations feel like negotiations instead of connections. Every discussion, no matter how small, turns into a careful strategic dance where both people are more focused on protecting their position than understanding the other person. You're not talking to share or explore, you're talking to win. And when winning becomes more important than connecting, the foundation starts to crack. Let me paint you a picture of what this looks like in real life. A couple sits down to discuss vacation. Plans. Sounds simple, right? But within 3 minutes, it's escalated into a tense negotiation about whose family they visited last, who sacrificed more last year, and what's fair. The actual vacation, the possibility of joy, connection, shared experience, has completely disappeared from the conversation. All that's left is the scorecard, the tally of who owes whom, the bitter arithmetic of a relationship keeping score. This dynamic shows up everywhere once it takes root. Discussions about household chores become negotiations about equity and contribution. Conversations about intimacy turn into debates about who's been more available or more stressed. Even simple decisions like what to watch on TV can become miniature power struggles. The therapeutic insight here is crucial. When you're defending more than listening, therapy isn't optional. It's urgent, because this pattern doesn't improve on its own. It metastasizes. What's happening beneath the surface is a fundamental shift from we thinking to me versus you thinking. In healthy relationships, partners approach problems as a team tackling a shared challenge. In relationships that need intervention, partners approach each other as opponents in an ongoing negotiation. This isn't necessarily conscious. Most people don't wake up and decide to treat their partner as an adversary, but hurt, unmet needs, and accumulated resentments slowly transform the dynamic from collaborative to combative. I worked with a couple, Jennifer and David, who perfectly illustrated this pattern. They came to therapy ostensibly because they couldn't agree on anything anymore. But as we dug deeper, the real issue emerged. Neither of them felt heard, so both had stopped genuinely listening. Every conversation had become a competition for airtime, for validation, for being right. They'd forgotten how to be curious about each other's perspectives because they were so focused on defending their own. The moment this pattern clicked for Jennifer was when I asked her to repeat back what David had just said. Not to argue with it, just to demonstrate she'd heard it. She couldn't do it. Despite having just spent 5 minutes responding to his comments, she actually hadn't absorbed what he was saying. She'd been so busy formulating her counter-argument that his actual words never registered. That realization shook her. She'd been defending against a position she hadn't even accurately understood. This is what happens when relationship advice, real story insights meet actual practice. We all intellectually know that listening is important, but in the heat of feeling misunderstood or attacked, that knowledge vanishes. The defensive walls go up automatically. Your body shifts into a protective stance. Your mind races to gather evidence for your position. And the person in front of you, the person you presumably love, becomes just an obstacle to getting your point across. The shift from connection to competition doesn't announce itself. It creeps in during stressful seasons. New babies, job changes, financial pressure, illness, grief. During these vulnerable times, when both partners desperately need support but have little to give, the negotiation mindset often takes root. Instead of acknowledging that you're both struggling and neither has capacity, you start keeping score about who's suffering more or who's carrying more weight. Compassion gets replaced by scorekeeping. What makes this particularly insidious is that the negotiation mindset feels righteous. You genuinely believe you're being reasonable, asking for fairness, standing up for yourself, and maybe you are. But somewhere along the way, being right became more important than being close. Winning the argument became more valuable than understanding your partner's underlying fear or need. And that trade-off, repeated over months or years, fundamentally alters the nature of your relationship. Here's the hard truth that couples, therapy session after session confirms. If you've reached the point where most conversations feel adversarial, you've already traveled quite far down a dangerous path. This isn't normal relationship conflict. This is a signal that the foundational trust and goodwill that relationships require has been significantly eroded. And that erosion doesn't stop on its own. It requires intentional intervention, new skills, and often professional guidance to reverse. The second warning sign cuts even deeper. You feel lonelier with them than without them. Imagine this scene: a couple eating dinner together at their kitchen table, plates full, phones down, physically present. But the silence between them isn't comfortable. It's suffocating. They have nothing to say to each other, or perhaps too much that feels too dangerous to speak. This is the loneliest kind of loneliness, the isolation that exists inside togetherness. When you're physically alone, loneliness makes sense. Your brain understands the absence. But when you're sitting across from your partner, lying next to them at night, existing in the same space, and still feeling utterly isolated, that creates a specific kind of pain that's hard to name. It's the grief of being unseen by the person who's supposed to know you best. It's the ache of sharing a life with someone who feels like a stranger. This toxic relationship sign manifests in countless small ways. You have exciting news, and your first instinct isn't to call them. It's to text a friend. You're struggling with something difficult, and you don't even consider talking to them about it because you know they won't really listen or understand. You feel more authentically yourself when they're not around. The person who should be your safe harbor has become someone you need refuge from. I remember Elena, who sat in my office and said something that broke my heart. I feel less alone when he's traveling for work than when he's home. She wasn't being dramatic. She meant it literally. His physical presence without emotional availability was more painful than his absence. At least when he was gone, she could fill the space with friends, activities, her own thoughts. When he was home but emotionally absent, that absence filled every room. This is what the statistics about emotional abuse in marriage often miss: the quiet suffering that doesn't have visible bruises. It's not always about overt cruelty. Sometimes it's just the slow starvation of being in a relationship where you're never truly met, where your bids for connection go unanswered, where vulnerability is either ignored or weaponized, where the basic human need to be known by your person remains chronically unmet. The therapeutic insight here is profound. Loneliness within love is a form of grief. You're grieving the relationship you thought you'd have, the connection you once felt, or the partnership you imagined when you committed to this person. And that grief is complicated because the person is still there. You can't fully mourn the loss because they're sitting right in front of you. So you exist in this liminal space of neither fully together nor fully apart. What makes this particularly confusing is that from the outside, everything might look fine. You're still a couple. You still do couple things, grocery shopping, bill paying, maybe even family vacations. But inside the relationship, there's an emotional desert. You've learned to function together without actually connecting. You've become efficient roommates managing a shared life, but the intimacy, the true seeing and being seen, has disappeared. Here's the key line that captures this reality. The loneliest moments are the ones spent next to someone who's already gone emotionally. This isn't about physical abandonment. It's about the presence of absence, the way someone can be right there and completely unavailable at the same time. It's about the profound disconnection of being with someone who's checked out, shut down, or simply stopped showing up emotionally. Many people in this situation blame themselves. They wonder if they're too needy, too sensitive, too demanding. They try to shrink their needs, to require less, to be more independent. But the fundamental human need for emotional connection in intimate relationships isn't a flaw, it's a feature. We're wired for it. When that connection is consistently absent or inadequate, it creates legitimate suffering. This isn't about being overdependent. It's about being in a relationship that's failing to meet basic emotional needs. The challenge is that by the time couples recognize this pattern and seek relationship therapy stories and guidance, significant damage has often occurred. The lonely partner has usually spent months or years trying to solve the problem alone, communicating their needs more clearly, lowering their expectations, finding fulfillment elsewhere. And the withdrawn partner has often spent that same time either oblivious to the problem or overwhelmed by it, retreating further rather than engaging. The third warning sign is one of the most frustrating. Arguments never resolve, they just repeat. You've had the same fight 20 times, using slightly different words but covering identical ground. Nothing changes, nothing improves. You end up exactly where you started, except now you're both more exhausted and resentful. This repetition isn't coincidence. It's a clear signal that something deeper isn't being addressed. Think about the couples you know, or perhaps your own experience. The same conflict surfaces again and again about money, in-laws, parenting, household responsibilities, sex, time, attention. The details might vary slightly, but the core issue remains untouched. You argue, maybe one person apologizes, or you both just drop it from exhaustion, and then weeks or months later, there it is again, like a ghost that won't stay buried. This cycle is one of the clearest indicators that professional intervention is needed. What's actually happening in these repetitive conflicts is that you're fighting about the surface issue, the dishes, the budget, the schedule, but the real wound is underneath. Maybe it's about feeling disrespected, or not being valued, or fear of abandonment, or control, or 100 other deep emotional needs that aren't being spoken directly. So you keep having the same argument because you're never actually addressing what the argument is truly about. The therapeutic insight here is crucial. Repetition equals unhealed emotional wounds. These recurring conflicts are your relationship's way of trying to bring attention to something that needs healing. It's like a warning light on your car dashboard that keeps coming on because you're not addressing the underlying mechanical problem. You can keep resetting the light, but until you fix the actual issue, it will continue to signal distress. I worked with Marcus and Tracy, who fought about Tracy's relationship with her mother at least twice a month for 3 years. Same argument, same positions, same outcome. Nothing resolved. When we finally dug into what was really happening, it turned out the fight wasn't about Tracy's mother at all. It was about Marcus feeling like he came second in Tracy's priorities, and Tracy feeling like Marcus was trying to control her relationships. Neither had ever directly named these core fears. Once we identified the real issue, the underlying emotional needs and fears, the surface conflict about Tracy's mother became much easier to navigate. But it took professional guidance to break through the repetitive pattern and access the deeper conversation. This is what happens in effective couples therapy sessions. The therapist helps you identify what you're really fighting about, which is often quite different from what you think you're fighting about. Here's what many people don't realize. Unhealed wounds don't disappear. They recycle themselves until you face them. This is true for individual trauma, and it's equally true for relational wounds. That time you felt dismissed or betrayed or abandoned doesn't just vanish because you didn't talk about it. It goes underground, gaining power, and resurfaces in increasingly distorted forms. The fight about who forgot to buy milk is really about the time you felt uncared for, and it was never addressed. The repetitive nature of these conflicts also creates its own damage over time. Each time you have the same argument, you're reinforcing negative neural pathways. Your brain learns that this is just what happens. Conflict leads to disconnection. Nothing changes. There's no point in hoping for something different. Both partners develop a kind of learned helplessness about the relationship's capacity to improve. This accumulation of failed attempts at resolution breeds deep hopelessness. What's particularly painful is how these repeated conflicts erode goodwill and benefit of the doubt. Early in the relationship, you might have approached conflict assuming positive intent from your partner, but after the 20th version of the same fight with no resolution, you start assuming the worst. Every similar situation triggers anticipatory frustration or defensive posturing. You're no longer responding to what's actually happening now. You're responding to the pattern, the history, the expectation of disappointment. This is where the marriage counseling gone wrong stories often originate. Couples wait so long, let the pattern get so entrenched that even professional help struggles to reverse the damage. The repetitive conflicts have created such deep grooves of reactivity that it becomes extraordinarily difficult to respond differently. But here's the hope. With skilled guidance, commitment from both partners, and willingness to access the deeper wounds, even long-standing patterns can shift. The fourth warning sign is particularly heartbreaking. Affection feels like obligation rather than genuine desire. Picture this moment. Your partner says, "I love you," but there's no warmth in their voice, no light in their eyes. It's a checkbox being ticked, a social script being performed. The words are there, but the feeling behind them has evaporated. When love becomes a duty rather than a feeling, something fundamental has broken in the relationship. This shows up in countless ways beyond just verbal expressions. Sex becomes scheduled and mechanical rather than spontaneous and passionate. Kisses become quick pecks, a ritual upon leaving or arriving rather than genuine expressions of desire. Physical touch happens because it's supposed to, not because either person is genuinely moved to connect. You go through the motions of affection because you know these are things couples do, but the authentic emotional impulse has died. What makes this particularly confusing is that relationships do naturally evolve from the intense passion of early romance to something more stable and companionate. That shift is normal and healthy, but there's a profound difference between mature, steady love and affection that's become hollow performance. Mature love still carries genuine warmth, care, and desire. It's just expressed differently. Obligatory affection is empty, a facade maintained to avoid acknowledging how disconnected you've become. The relationship therapy stories I hear most often include this painful revelation. One partner finally admits, "I don't feel anything when he touches me anymore," or "I say I love her because I know I should, but I'm not sure I actually feel it." These confessions are devastating, but they're also important. Naming the truth is the first step toward deciding whether this relationship can be revived or whether it's time to acknowledge it's already ended. When affection feels rehearsed, it's no longer connection, it's performance. You're acting the part of a loving partner rather than being one. And both people usually feel this, even if they're not talking about it. The person going through the motions feels guilty and fake. The person receiving the obligatory affection feels the emptiness, the absence of genuine warmth, and it hurts in a particular way, to be loved out of duty rather than genuine desire. I remember Nathan and Carla, married 14 years, who came to therapy because their sex life had completely died. But as we talked, it became clear that the sexual disconnection was just the most visible symptom of a much broader loss of genuine affection. They hugged goodbye in the morning because that's what couples do. They said "love you" at the end of phone calls out of habit. But neither could remember the last time they'd touched each other because they actually wanted to. because they were moved by genuine affection. This pattern often develops gradually, similarly to the other warning signs. Maybe it starts during a particularly stressful period: new baby, job loss, illness, grief. During crisis, affection often takes a back seat to just surviving. That's understandable and normal. But when the crisis passes and the affection doesn't return, or when the habit of disconnection has become so ingrained that neither person remembers how to authentically reach for the other, that's when you know professional help is needed. The insight about emotional emptiness and forced connection is this: we can sense inauthenticity even when we can't articulate it. Your body knows the difference between a hug that comes from genuine warmth and one that comes from obligation. Your nervous system registers whether your partner's "I love you" carries emotional resonance or is just autopilot words. We might not consciously acknowledge this difference, but we feel it, and over time it creates a deep sense of rejection and loneliness. What compounds this issue is that many people feel tremendous guilt about their loss of genuine affection. They tell themselves they should feel more, should want their partner more, should be more grateful or loving or engaged. This guilt often leads to increased performance of affection, trying harder to say and do the right things, which paradoxically makes the inauthenticity even more pronounced. You can't force genuine feeling, and trying to do so just highlights its absence. Here's where the fear comes in. If affection has become obligation, does that mean the relationship is over? Not necessarily, but it does mean the relationship desperately needs intervention. Sometimes genuine feeling can be rekindled when underlying resentments are addressed, when emotional wounds are healed, when new patterns of connection are established. But this kind of transformation requires both people to be willing to do deep, uncomfortable work. The fifth and perhaps most critical warning sign is when silence replaces honesty. This is where we begin to build toward the emotional climax of understanding what silence really means in relationships. Picture this exchange. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine." But they're not fine, not even close. They've just decided that honesty is no longer safe or worth the effort. This shift from authentic communication to protective silence is often the final stage before a relationship dies completely. This is different from the comfortable silence of secure attachment, where both people feel safe enough to be quiet together. This is protective silence, defensive silence, the silence of resignation. It's what happens when you've tried to communicate your truth and been dismissed, minimized, or attacked enough times that you stop trying. It's what happens when honesty consistently leads to conflict without resolution. So silence seems like the safer option. Here's what this looks like in practice. You're hurt by something your partner said, but instead of addressing it, you swallow it. You're struggling with something difficult, but you don't share it because you know they won't really listen, or they'll make it about themselves. You have needs that aren't being met, but you've stopped asking because you're tired of the disappointment. Each instance of choosing silence over honesty builds the wall between you higher. When therapy reveals the truth about these patterns, it's often shocking for both partners. The silent partner often doesn't realize how much they've been withholding. They've become so accustomed to swallowing their truth that they barely register doing it anymore. And the other partner is often genuinely surprised to learn about all the unspoken pain, the hidden resentments, the private disappointments. They had no idea because the silence had become so complete. I worked with a couple, Rachel and Tom, where Rachel had essentially stopped being honest about anything that mattered. Tom would ask how she was doing, and she'd say fine, even when she was drowning. He'd ask if something was bothering her after she'd been quiet for days, and she'd say, "No, I'm just tired." For 2 years, she maintained this facade of okayness, while internally she was leaving the relationship emotionally. By the time they got to therapy, she was completely checked out. What Rachel eventually revealed in therapy was devastating. Silence means I've stopped believing you'll listen. She hadn't always been silent. Early in their relationship, and even in the first years of marriage, she'd been expressive about her needs and feelings. But over time, Tom's consistent pattern of defensiveness, dismissiveness, or making her concerns about his own hurt had taught her that honesty was dangerous. So she went underground with her emotional life. This is the pattern that relationship advice, real story after story, confirms. Silence isn't usually the first response. It's the last one. Before silence comes attempts at communication. Before giving up comes trying to be heard. The silence that replaces honesty is earned through repeated experiences of being misunderstood, invalidated, or punished for vulnerability. It's a protective mechanism, but it's also the death knell of intimacy because intimacy requires truth. What makes this particularly tragic is that the partner being shut out often has no idea why. From Tom's perspective, Rachel just suddenly became distant and uncommunicative. He didn't connect her silence to his years of defensive responses because each individual instance seemed minor to him. He didn't realize that his pattern of making her concerns about his hurt feelings had created an environment where honesty felt unsafe for her. The accumulation was invisible to him. This dynamic is also closely related to patterns of husband gaslighting wife or other forms of emotional manipulation. When one partner consistently denies the other's reality, reframes their concerns as oversensitivity, or uses the other's honesty against them later, silence becomes the only form of self-protection available. The silent partner learns that their truth will be distorted or weaponized, so they stop offering it. This creates a terrible isolation where neither person actually knows the other anymore. By the time couples reach this stage, where silence has fully replaced honesty, the relationship is in critical condition. The foundation of trust necessary for intimacy has been so eroded that both people are essentially strangers hiding their real selves from each other. Tom didn't know that Rachel was desperately unhappy. Rachel didn't believe Tom was capable of truly hearing her. They lived together but existed in completely separate emotional realities, connected only by logistics and history. So what does silence really mean in relationships? This is where we need to reframe our entire understanding of what's happening when communication dies. Silence isn't peace. It's the sound of something breaking quietly. It's not the comfortable quiet of two people who understand each other. It's the heavy, loaded quiet of things unsaid, feelings unexpressed, needs unmet, and hope slowly dying. When you recognize this kind of silence in your relationship, you're hearing the sound of disconnection. But here's the crucial insight that when therapy reveals the truth about these patterns, silence is a message, not emptiness. When your partner goes quiet, they're telling you something important. They're just not using words to do it. They're saying, "I don't feel safe," or "I've given up on being heard," or "I'm protecting myself from more hurt," or "I don't know how to reach you anymore." The absence of words is itself a communication, and learning to understand that communication is essential. Silence can mean protection. If I speak my truth, I'll be attacked or dismissed. It can mean fear. If I'm honest about how I really feel, this relationship will end. It can mean resignation. Nothing I say will make a difference, so why bother? Each of these meanings requires a different response, and none of them are solved by simply demanding that your partner talk. The silence is a symptom of a much deeper relational injury that needs healing. What often happens in couples therapy session work is that we have to create a new kind of safe space where silence can be broken. This requires the previously defensive or dismissive partner to demonstrate, through actions, not just promises, that honesty will be received differently now. It requires the silent partner to risk vulnerability again despite the history of being hurt. It's delicate work, rebuilding trust after it's been broken through repeated small betrayals of emotional safety. But here's the hope. Silence can also be the space where healing begins, if someone chooses to listen. Not listening to fill the silence with words or explanations or defenses, but truly listening with openness and curiosity to what the silence is communicating. When one partner stops defending and starts genuinely seeking to understand, when the silent partner is met with real receptivity instead of more of the same patterns, that's when transformation becomes possible. Let's recap the 5 warning signs we've explored today. Conversations that feel like negotiations, where winning matters more than connecting. Loneliness that exists within togetherness. Arguments that repeat endlessly without resolution. Affection that feels like obligation rather than genuine desire. And silence that replaces honesty. If even one of these patterns resonates with your experience, your relationship is asking for help. If multiple patterns are present, the need for intervention is urgent. These signs aren't accusations or judgments. They're invitations to awareness. Recognizing them is actually a sign of health, not weakness. It means you're still paying attention. You're still hoping for something better. You're still willing to face uncomfortable truths. That willingness is precisely what's needed to create change. The relationships that make it are almost never the ones without problems. They're the ones where people are willing to acknowledge problems and seek help addressing them. Here's the closing thought I want to leave with you. If your relationship has fallen into silence, don't mistake it for calm. Sometimes, silence is love waiting to be heard again. It's not that the love has necessarily disappeared. It's that it's been buried under hurt, disappointment, unmet needs, and failed attempts at connection. But buried doesn't mean dead. With professional guidance, genuine commitment from both partners, and courage to face what's been hidden, that love can sometimes be uncovered and renewed. The journey from silence back to authentic connection isn't easy. It requires vulnerability when you've been hurt, openness when you've grown defensive, honesty when silence has felt safer, and hope when resignation has settled in. It requires both people to take responsibility for their contributions to the patterns while also extending grace for being imperfect humans doing their best. Most importantly, it requires acknowledging that you can't fix these patterns alone. You need help, guidance, and a new framework for relating to each other. Share this with someone who might be mistaking silence for peace, someone who needs to hear that the quiet in their relationship isn't necessarily okay, and that seeking help isn't giving up. It's the bravest form of fighting for what matters. If this message resonated with you, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell because we're continuing this conversation. Next time, we'll talk about what actually happens in therapy when couples face these patterns